phone for the beginning portion. So we're going to start the recording, and I have the pleasure of welcoming Geoff Mead, calling in from the UK, and he's the author and noted storyteller who's going to be talking to about his work, telling the story, the heart and soul of successful leadership. Now, Geoff, you and I had a few minutes to speak last week, or about a week ago. And rather than go into your bio and talk, I'm going to let you take the lead, and you've providing us some wonderful slides and presentations. So it's all about you for the next few minutes. And then at the end, we'll do Q&As and have people weighing in.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I see a lot of what I take to be Russian names now. Artem, that's clearly your fan club rather than mine, but they're very...
No, they're all yours, Geoff. They're all yours.
So I'm delighted to do this. I've been working in and around story and leadership for quite a long time, probably about 20 years when I first began, and 15 years since I really decided that's what I do, or that's the core of what I do. And I guess I'm here because I wrote a book or two about it, and I have a small practice about that. And so I'm very happy to share a bit about my approach to the work, a tiny bit about my background. And one of the things I thought I'd like to introduce particularly is, as a practitioner, as a story practitioner, what are some of the dilemmas, the questions that I carry, which seem particularly current? Because I think it's a troubling time in many ways, and it's a troubling time for us as story practitioners when, you know, the whole role of story, I think, is challenged, and one could even argue that it's in danger of being discredited. So I think there's quite significant challenges for us, at least I believe so. So that's what I'd like to try and do. I've got some pictures to talk to that would help me, and they're probably better looking than I am. So if I put those up on the screen, I'll do a little bit of talking to that, if that's okay. And I'll keep an eye on time and try not to go on too long. So I'm going to press the share button, and that should, if I get this right, give you a slide. Can you see a slide?
Yes.
It says Heart and Soul, the Art of Narrative Leadership, yeah?
Yes.
Good. Okay, well, these are the two books that we spoke about. I wrote the first one in 2011 after I trained as a storyteller. After my first career, which was in the police service, and the last half of that was in leadership development work in the police service. So I became the director of the UK National Police High Flyers Programme in the late 80s, got involved in that work. When I left the service in 2002, I went on sabbatical. I bumped into storytelling. I got fascinated by it, and fascinated by what I saw as a connection to leading and leadership, which wasn't very well articulated then at all. My first pull, and it's a pull that brings me back time and time again, is how our human stories seem to be informed by and reflected in the whole wealth of traditional story around the world. So the first book I wrote was about that. And then in 2014, kind of on the back of that, I pulled together reflections and thoughts and practices from 10 to 15 years working quite intensively in organizations with stories, particularly, and my particular interest is in leading and leadership. So, you know, there are folk who do brand storytelling and folk who do other kinds of storytelling, and that's not where my interest takes me. It's very much about the individual and how they connect with other people and how they connect with themselves. This is where I used to work. This is Bramshill, which was the old police staff college. If you look at the picture, mine is the top left-hand floor, which is by saying mine rather grandly. I ended up there, but that was a reward for 10 years of working in a porter cabin behindhand, and that's when I began to work with leading and leadership. And I realized over the course of many years working in that field that leadership, although we have to use the word as a figure of speech, is pretty meaningless. It's an abstract noun. When I run programs these days, which I often do in business schools for groups of executives, I kind of shock them by starting the session by saying, you know, I'm profoundly uninterested in leadership. And then when they just kind of slightly rock back on the heels, I say, but I'm very interested in leading. What is it we do when we're doing this thing we call leadership? I propose, and it's the heart of my work really, that one of the things we do, not the only thing by all means, but one of the things we do is when we're leading, we're trying to create meaning in complex, difficult, contested circumstances with other people, sometimes for other people. If you like, when leadership in my book, the bit that's interesting to me is about meaning making in a community of practice. It's kind of social construction view of the world. And whenever I've proposed that to groups of leaders in all sorts of industries and businesses, they've nodded. I've never had anyone who said, no, I don't do that. That's not what I do. Everyone says, yeah, actually, a lot of my work is about trying to make sense of experience, trying to make sense of the world, convey it, explain it, and get people on board. So I think the case for story is fairly straightforward. I argue that it is intrinsic to us as human beings in at least three levels, the first of which is our sense of self. And this is relevant because these three levels kind of frame the practice I use with what I call narrative leadership. So at the very sort of heart of it is that our sense of self, I propose, is narrative. That who we think we are is a more or less coherent set of stories. Too rigid, we can't move. Too flexible, too fragmented, and we're in serious trouble. But somewhere in the middle is a collection of stories that are more or less coherent, which gives us the opportunity to grow, develop, change, and reflect on what are the stories that nourish us, and what are the stories that are limiting for us and for others, and what are the stories that are just past their sell-by date. Mm-hmm. So that takes us to the heart of the first practice of narrative leadership, which is going to know yourself, know your stories. And if someone asks you, what do you stand for? Don't give the answer that you think you ought to give. Dig deep, find out who you are. The second plank, if you like, is this okay to carry on? The second plank is I propose that stories are a sort of social glue, that we bring groups and organizations and communities and societies together through the sharing of stories. And conversely, when we don't share stories, when we stop being interested in other people's stories, it's both a reflection and a cause of fragmentation, social fragmentation. And there are many instances of that, nationally. I guess in South Africa, you can point to apartheid, where the stories of one part of the community made no sense to the other.
Вот я сейчас подключилась на вебинар,
Hello.
который идет в Zoom.
Hello. Hello.
We muted. Somebody joined us.
Oh, great. Good. Hi. So we're just into a bit of a chat about the theoretical basis of the work. So there's something about, in an organizational context, whose stories count, whose stories are not heard. And I think many organizations are getting better. I've done a lot of work in the health service in the UK, and that's become very aware now of patient stories, for example. But when I first started this work, the one group of people whose stories were never heard around the boardroom tables of health organizations were the patients. Now they are. And the third one, I argue, is that there's a way in which stories, often in a hidden or invisible way, shape the way we see the world. These big stories that we almost forget our stories. We forget their constructions. We assume they are a reality. So one version of that is to say, well, we've come in the Western Northern Hemispheres, we've kind of lived in the myth of the industrial growth society for 150 years, to the point where we forgot that it's one construction. And now it's getting a bit shaky. We kind of realize that it's a construction and that there are others. And, stories, for good or ill, are shaping our futures. We're in the midst of this turmoil in the United Kingdom over Brexit at the moment. And you could say it's an argument between two stories. In my book, the bigger, more inclusive, more generative story of the coming together, and the smaller story, the more exclusive, the more backward-looking story of going it alone. But the people who are supporting Brexit have found a way of arguing their case in a very cogent story. I don't believe it, I don't want to support it, but it's very cogent and it's won a great deal of support. So this is kind of the third plank, really. And on the basis of that, I think the stories we tell, a bit like in appreciative inquiry, where they say the questions are fateful, I say that the stories we tell are fateful, because I don't think we can actually change anything significantly or substantively or qualitatively unless we can reimagine them. Or to put it in shorthand, nothing changes unless the stories change. This is the logo for my business, and it's it's a well used metaphor, but I use the metaphor of the tree. The roots are the stories of identity, the knowing oneself. Dig deep, finding out what really matters to us. The branches and leaves are interesting because they're kind of connective. They're more about listening to and engaging with the world in order that we can then stand for something. And I don't know what other people's practices, I'll be very interested to hear, but people sometimes come and what they want is this, they want the trunk, they want the good story to tell without doing the work of either digging deep or listening hard. And I kind of try and insist on that, as that's the first work to do. So that leads to these three practices: knowing yourself, finding, sharing and digging into one's own stories, connecting and listening to stories, and then deciding, in the midst of that, what do I stand for? What's the world calling for? What do I really care about? Where do they meet? And what's the story I then have to tell in that space? So that's really the practice I have. And it's written up in some length in the Telling a Story book with lots of examples. If it's okay, what I'd like to do, and I'd like to check this with you, Julianne, would it be right to sort of shift into some of these dilemmas and questions, which I think might be of
Yes,
interest?
I think
Can I do that?
everyone values like first-hand perspective. So I'm just trying to find one person that I need to. I don't know. Yes, do go on.
Someone's underwater, I think. Okay. So, the world's in a pretty precarious place at the moment. And it seems to me that we need to be very thoughtful about how we engage. We are practitioners of an art, of a form, and we are citizens, and we have choices to make ourselves about where we stand on issues, and where we try and lend the weight of our practice. And the three dilemmas that came up for me when I was thinking of this at the talk were these. As story practitioners, when we go out in organizations, whose interests are we serving? These are not questions that I have answers to, but these are questions that seem to come up. Like, what's the organization in service of? What am I, explicitly, consciously trying to support, and what am I perhaps unconsciously lending support to? So I thought I'd perhaps talk around that one in a minute. The second area is, has storytelling become a discredited form? 10 years ago it was new, and then it was all the rage, and now we live in the world, the time of fake news and questioning about what's true and whether truth matters, and are we just making up stories? And I think I get some backlash around this now. Other practitioners do, but how do we make sure we ground our stories in something that retains their integrity? I think it's a really challenging thing, and something to think about, particularly when it comes to leadership. And the third one is, I suppose, an extension of that is just a reflection, really, like, what stories do we need right now? I don't think there's any easy answer to that, but there are some sub-questions to those. So perhaps if I just point to each of those three areas in turn, would that be all right? And it will shift us into a kind of conversational mode. If I go back to this first one, about whose interests are we serving, the system world and the life world. So there's a thinker, Jürgen Habermas, who I've been quite influenced by, who talks about the system world and the life world. The system world is the world of organizations of many kinds: political, social, economic, business. And it's a purposive, rational world. These systems and organizations exist for a purpose, to achieve something, and they have a certain logic to them. And he argues that logic is different from the logic of the life world. So my little kind of images might be, the City of London, Canary Wharf. I was working there a couple of weeks ago with one of these big accountancy firms. And if that stands for the system world, then this is the life world. They're caricatures, of course, but they do kind of reflect a different logic. When we're in one place, we seem to think and care about certain things. And when we're in another, we seem to think and care about other things. And my concern, and what Habermas says, is one of the reasons we're in trouble is that the two worlds have become disconnected. That we kind of switch off our humanity, if we're not careful, when we get sucked into the system world, because it is so pervasive, so demanding, so rigorous of a certain kind of mindset, achiever, expert mindset, that it's very hard to bring our humanity into that place. And I think for me, that's an edge and a challenge as a storyteller or a story worker, is how can I, in small ways, and I don't have any grandiose ambition about what I do, how can I, in small ways, encourage people to show up in this place with more of that self available? So Habermas called that having a communicative space where these might speak to each other. And that's often done in small ways, just getting people telling each other small domestic stories, getting businessmen to do that in their organizational setting, in their suits and ties, to kind of break down the barriers a bit. And I think those small things make a big difference. The second point of that is ambit and ambition. And it comes to really, this is from the New Yorker, and it's a slide I can't often show when I'm working in business. When I'm getting people to think about stories in the future and how they want to lead. It's like, how big a story are we invested in? We put our life energy into work. I don't differentiate from leading and living, really. That, how can you be? You're living your life in a particular context. To what end? For what purpose? What are the drivers, and what's big enough? And this little cartoon, which it causes a kind of a smile, but kind of a gasp. There is like, oh, okay. What am I really here to do? And I think these issues are, in some organizations, getting much more concerned, but we've got a long way to go, I think, because the pressures of the system world are so systemically ingrained that it's very hard to cut through and say, hang on a minute, we're doing this really well, but it's not getting us very far. So if that's sort of two aspects of that first dilemma of whose interests are we serving, is it big enough? Is it the life world as well as the system world? The second dilemma is to do with populism, truth and lies. We've always had propaganda, we've always had sort of political spin, but it does seem to have been ramped up hugely, certainly in this country, and as far as I can tell, across in America, and for all I know, in other countries in Europe that I do know and some that I don't know. It seems to be a time when truth can be said, it's what I say. That makes it true. And we seem to have lost something, or in danger of losing something. And, how do we play into that? How do we, in our work, try and help people understand what it is to tell stories that are grounded? I'm a bit of an academic. I mean, I teach and work in business schools and write, so I sometimes call on different thinkers to help me. And one of them is this guy, Jean Baudrillard, is a French philosopher. This slide has got at least 3 dead white men in it, I think, so you'll have to excuse me for that. But he got this lovely idea about this relationship between storytelling and truth. And he speaks about a representation, which is an authentic attempt to try and represent, to the best of one's ability, partial as that is, the underlying reality. Then we talk about, he talks something like a trace, which masks that reality. So that's where we use euphemism, for example, to disguise reality. So we talk about biomass as opposed to, salmon and bears and eagles, because it helps us take the emotion out of it. We kind of diminish the living reality of something. It's kind of non-story language, for us storytellers. Then we talk about void, which is simply ignoring something, pretending it doesn't exist. An example in this country, in UK, would be for many, many years, and probably I couldn't put the date on exactly, but for the back end of the 20th century, and certainly up until the 2010s, there were no. You look at television, there were no gay characters. In UK, there were no black faces.
Mm-hmm.
It just was kind of ignored. It's written out, kind of written out of reality. And then you get to the fourth stage, which is the simulacrum, which is, I think, the danger of what we're doing with the level of spin we have, which is a story that has no relation to reality whatsoever. It's a free-floating story. And an example I would give that historically is Enron, which became Enron, the energy company, became a story. That's all it had. It told us a particular story about itself, which had no relationship to the underlying reality of its activities or its financial health.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're in danger, I think, of doing that. The second bit of that is, again, calling on someone else who'll be familiar to you, I'm sure, or some of you, is George Lakoff. He wrote a wonderful little book, which I often refer people to. And as an author, I don't refer people to many other people's books because, why would I? But he wrote this one, Don't Think of an Elephant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to look at how the very language we use shapes the discourse. And we can lend our support unwittingly to a discourse by speaking against it, as opposed to finding our own discourse. So without taking a side on these issues, when anti-abortion became pro-life, for example, that was seizing the discourse, that was framing the discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And when pro-abortion became pro-choice, that was an attempt to change a different discourse. So he points to how we consciously and unconsciously create and support different discourses. And as story practitioners, I think, what discourse am I supporting here?
Mm-hmm.
Negative stories tend to support the discourse of that they're actually speaking against.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that, right. The third area, if I may, and just kind of move on to that, is this one of I just take the point of, what stories do we need right now? And I suppose one of the most pressing and significant issues of our lifetimes and our children's and our grandchildren's lifetimes is, climate change, or the state of the world generally, the natural world, whether it's species degradation, whether it's climate change, whether it's deforestation, whatever, we have things to think about there. And there we have to think, whose stories do we support? We've got competing stories going on. You've got, even this is a lovely, this is a sculpture in Berlin. It's called Politicians Talking About Climate Change. I rather like it. It's like, it's so slow. How hard do we push, I think, is a question. And on the other hand, you've got this extraordinary phenomenon here, Greta, who has a story. Apart from anything else, she has she embodies and represents, whether you agree with her or not, it's not relevant to my point. She embodies and represents a very powerful story. And I think it's an object lesson for us as story practitioners, particularly if we hold what we might consider to be progressive values, that it doesn't matter how right you are, it doesn't matter how right you are, unless you can support it with a story that people are touched by. The final point I wanted to make was one about, this is an image I found which represents for me a phenomenon which is known as narrative wreckage.
Mm-hmm.
It's Arthur Frank writes about it. You may have come across him. Wrote a wonderful book called The Wounded Storyteller. He is, I suppose, he's an academic, and I guess he's, you might say he's a medical sociologist, maybe. But his interest is in the narrativization of medicine and the de-narrativization of patients when they're being treated. So that, Fred Jones becomes the coronary artery bypass graft in bed 3, if you like, the depersonalization, and the way in which, in our attempt in that medical context to help people, we rob them of their stories. Mm-hmm. And the point, I think, is more generally made that we seem to be in a time of narrative wreckage, when the stories upon which we relied to make sense of the world are falling apart around our ears. And as Thomas Berry, the environmentalist, said, we don't have a new story, and we're in trouble. And it just seems that we are living in a time when that's not possible. As storytellers, that's part of our reality, is that we're living in this in-between time. And what does that demand of us? We can't lean back on conventional stories of the world as perhaps we used to, nor is there an obvious story to tell about how things might be, because there we get in danger of creating a kind of impractical utopian vision of something. So how do we work with this multiplicity of story? How do we work with breakdown? Whose stories should we be interested in these days? And I think an example of that would be the changing over time, where there was a time when the stories told about the British Empire were stories of daring do and young men fresh out of Oxford going out and conquering the world. We're not interested in those stories anymore. In fact, we regard them with great suspicion and distaste. We're very interested in the stories of those who've been marginalized or oppressed. So these things do change. And it seems to me that we're in a sort of comparable situation at the moment, with a need to really take real interest in the stories of those, for example, in the poorer countries of the world that are most affected by the changes. Which leads me, neatly or not, to I was told by Artem that I had to tell a story. So I'm going to tell you a joke instead, because it's my favorite story. And it kind of reflects this sense of narrative wreckage, which many of us will have experienced at some time or other in our lives. And it goes like this. So one day, once upon a time, if you like, a man or a woman, you choose, was walking down the highway of their life, and without any warning, they fell into an existential void. Down, 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 down they went. Slippery, dark, pitch black, clinging on by their fingernails, and just managed to screech to a halt and look down it, and it go down to infinite depth, and it echoed, the slightest breath echoed into nothingness. It was terrifying. And after a while, the man or the woman called out, "Is there anybody there?" And after a long pause, a great voice boomed into the void, "Yes, I am here." And the man said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "I am your God." And the man said, "What should I do?" And the voice said, "Let go." And the man said, "Is there anybody else?" So, I do believe that stories can change the world still. I believe they change them for good and for ill. And that as story practitioners, we really have to think about what stories do we want to lend our support and weight to in order that we can make that difference. Which kind of brings me to the end of my practice piece, really. For those of you who are interested, my life has turned more and more to writing. I do less corporate work than I used to do. These days, mostly I'm working with groups of leaders from different organizations who are coming to a business school for a leadership program. Sometimes I'm asked to go in and work with individuals or groups within organizations independently of that, but often it's in that leadership context. And I'm very interested in, at a sort of therapeutic level now, how at a very personal level, the stories that we tell can be healing, or how we can use the power of story, and in particular writing stories or telling stories, to heal at an individual level. And I've written a couple of books that kind of speak to that, and I'll just show them to you. There's a memoir called Gone in the Morning, which I wrote after my wife died a few years ago, which was a kind of my naive, untutored attempt to write myself through narrative wreckage, really. And the other is a children's story, which speaks to, I think, what it is to be and what it is to understand that we're only on this earth for a while, and then we go home somewhere, somehow. So my passions are leaning more into this space now. Than I don't feel as hungry for the kind of corporate organizational work as I used to. I'm more turning towards working with people, individuals, my own colleagues, peers of my generation, about what are the stories we have to tell, and how can we continue to make them generative and meaningful as we get older.
Mhm.
That's all I wanted to say, really. So I can stop sharing. Press the stop sharing button and lose those things. Would that be a good thing to do?
Yeah, I want you to put the slide up before you leave. You have a slide at the end with your contact information of where
Oh, I do. Yeah, that one.
share that. And then before I mute people, I'm going to selfishly ask you a question. I
Okay.
was giving some thoughts after we talked and
Yeah.
looked at our notes. And if you could, knowing what you know now about storytelling and how it's impacted your work and how you work at leadership,
Yeah.
and then the work you did with Gestalt, you had to reverse, if you were able to reverse engineer and go back in time to the work you were doing earlier on in law enforcement, how do you think that would have changed how you approached your work or how you guided others?
That's a good question. I mean, when I was an operational police officer, I was a senior detective for many years. So I was very conscious of working with stories. You're trying to build a story, whether it's a case, you're looking at the evidence to build a story, but in a very instrumental kind of way. And I think when you're then trying to work with at a community level, rather than as the kind of not the kind of, as opposed to the enforcement level, you're trying to work with and help communities build and honor their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I went into leadership work in the police service, I think I had a sort of purely intuitive grasp that I didn't want to support a traditional view of leading and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a long time to come to this notion of story. But even early on, I had this sense that it's possible to come to know oneself
Mm-hmm.
through different activities and engagement with each other in ways that open up the possibility of change. I think if I'd understood this world of story better, I'd have been better at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I could have given people perhaps more agency
Mm-hmm.
for themselves to explore themselves and what they really want to do. So I don't know that looking back, I would have changed much, really, in the light of it. I think for me, it's been a kind of fairly natural development of something rather than a kind of a sudden break in perception. Suddenly I see the world differently. What it gave me was a completely new lens, but I was looking through it with the same heart and soul and looking at my area, what I was interested in fundamentally didn't change. And calling it heart and soul was a very deliberate move. To put heart and soul in the title of the book was the only thing I had to fight the publishers for, because I wanted to reclaim these very human ways of thinking and talking about how we are in the world, feeling, and soul for me has something to do with purpose, like what am I here for? So yeah,
Thank you.
I think I've had a go at answering your question, which was a good question, but I'm not sure I've fully done it justice.
I'm going to unmute us and then how do we do this? Hang on, bear with me. Unmute. Great.
Да, и напиши мне сейчас фамилию этого самого.
There's quite a number of people.
С кому вы собрались?
There's any
Хорошо, давайте, обнимаю вас.
and
Salud, ciao.
Okay.
Сейчас декабря.
And then raise your hand because quite a number of people.
Jules, if
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so we had one hand raised.
that's better.
Yeah, Artem, you're in controls too. Okay, why don't you ask your question, then we'll proceed.
I guess just before I ask my question, first of all, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us today. Secondly, for anyone listening, if you have a question, please raise your hand in the chat, and then Jules will unmute you, because it's just mayhem if we unmute everyone at the same time, as we just saw. And secondly, let me just repeat it in Russian for a sec, because I can't see a lot of Russians here. So, ребят, если вам нужно задать вопрос, вы хотите задать вопрос, поднимайте руку в чате, и Jules вас включит, вы сможете задать вопрос. Okay? So, my question is fairly simple, and I've honestly, I've read the book and I was fascinated by it, but there's, some practical feeling, the urge to see the answer, like what are the practical ways to develop those 3 practices? Like, how do I know myself? How do I hear the stories? And how do I find my trunk, like those stories to hear? If you could give like one advice per, like one practical advice per each practice, that would be great. Jules, I think Geoff is muted.
Oh,
I
no.
can unmute myself. Okay. Obviously there are many, many ways of self-discovery, and story offers something. And simple things that I do in, say for example, in the context of a coaching session or a leadership program, is let's imagine it's a group. I'll get people telling little stories in threes about particular times. For example, a time when they faced an obstacle and overcame it. Right? Simple, very simple, fail-safe. Everyone faced that in their life. And what happens is, as the stories are told, the listeners are looking into the story and seeing what are the qualities there, what are the values there. They're helping the individual get in touch with not the values they think they ought to believe in, but the ones that they actually do believe in or have acted upon. And it gives them a chance to check. So is that something that would continue to support me? Can I do that? So I think this thing about these stories, these little moments from life which are significant, are ways that story can help us into that realm. Of course, many people choose to go deeper in therapeutic contexts, but that is also really about discovering the narrative, that what's the dominant narratives, what are the alternative narratives that we might step into. So depending on where you're doing the work, one has the liberty and contract to go deeper. But in the context of working organizations, I find these very simple little stories do that. Or when someone, there's a story I tell in the book, in the book, which is the chairman of the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, huge organization.
David.
Yeah, David. And we asked him, why were you here? And he said, oh, blah, 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 blah. And then he kind of I said, what? And we said, what was the moment? What was the moment that gave you that value? Can you remember? And he went right back, into his childhood, straight away. For him, he could say, yes, at that moment, I understood something, and I can see a connection between that story and what I'm doing here. I think helping people do that is one way of digging down, going into the roots and drawing up, and getting them used to doing that. The second practice, I think, and I argue it to be the second practice, is this reaching out. And that's about listening, really. It's about a practice there is to get people, a simple practice is story circles, where you've got very mixed groups of people. You're trying to get out of the bubble so that you are sharing stories with people who are very different. And then you start to open up to a greater range of possibility. What's being asked for here? How do others see the world? How do I respond to what others are saying? And this is a simple story sharing activity. It's a slightly larger group, and you might repeat it in different ways, and you would set it up to have a lot of difference in the room. The first one I'm talking about, you don't need to do that. And then the thing about what story do you want to tell, I often do an exercise, which I don't think is in the book, where I get people to interview each other as if they were a certain time in the future, and from the perspective that they have been the kind of leader that they really would want to be. Not the one they think they ought to be, or the one they think the organization wants them to be. But if they led with heart and soul, and they made a really good success of it, what did they do looking back? So we're using the storyteller's imaginative practice to step into a different world, in this case in the future, and look back. And those kind of activities begin to give people a sense of, okay, so this is what I really care about. This is what I stand for. When I go back into work, I'm going to do things differently. This is how I'm going to do it. So there would be 3 simple practices. The kind of the sharing of the small value-laden story, and then exploring the values in it. The practice of listening and sharing stories with a heterogeneous group with a lot of difference in. So with an HMRC, for example, we brought in customs, we brought in people from frontline services who never had a voice around the boardroom table. Simple. This is, it's not rocket science, it's simple. And then this question of imaginatively, if I were the kind of leader that I would really want to be, if I were bold and generous, what would I have done? How would I have been different if I look back on it? And that seems to be much more powerful than getting people to sit in the present saying, what would I like to do differently?
Thank you. I'm going to unmute.
So much.
I see a David Tinker would like to speak, so I'm going to unmute you, David. Hey there.
I've just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Hi, David.
Hi, Geoff. Good to see you. This is
very nice to see you.
Geoff, you've beautifully raised issues to do with climate change, as well as we had a Brexit moment earlier, both of which may be contributing to anxiety. So it's kind of there, and I notice I think about climate change more and more every day, and some degree of, or I've got a high degree of worry, mainly for our children's children. I'm wondering about our relationship with story when we're feeling anxious. Do we select the stories we want to hear and cut out the others? Does it reduce our ability to tell our stories and therefore our meaning making, etc.? I just wonder what your thoughts were around our relationship with story. Does that change in the presence of our anxiety?
I think it's a very good question. I think it does. And, one of the anxiety leads us into sort of fight flight type situations. It's a kind of form of fear.
Sure.
So it can kind of lead to a self-protective storying. It can lead to a blocking, so that I'm not telling a story. It can lead to kind of running away and telling some other story, or denying something, or this doesn't exist at all. I think as a practitioner, and I bump into this, and I get it wrong sometimes, but it's like trying to judge how far you can take people. What's the edge? How far can you take people that's legitimate, that isn't just me offloading my stuff on them, but is encouraging them to find their edges at which they can still inquire and ask questions. So sometimes I think I've not pushed hard enough. Sometimes I push quite hard. So that little cartoon I showed earlier, I use it because it's a lovely little device. That little bit of humor takes people to an edge and gives them an opportunity to engage with something like, oh, okay, well, maybe if I'm a bit bigger here, maybe I can do something about it. So I think there's something about a certain level of anxiety or a certain level of disturbance, I think, is important to disrupt, a current way of thinking. But judging it is tricky, and getting it right when it does go right, you feel great. When it doesn't, you think, uh-oh, I won't be invited back here again. And that has happened a few times. But I think there is that question of helping people. It's not so much, it's trying to have some practices that will help people go to the edge that they're willing to explore.
Okay. So
when I invite people to tell a story about something, I always tell them, think about what it is you want to share. Take responsibility for that. And I often say, be bold, be generous, and look after yourself. And give people, it kind of gives people permission. Also, one of the things I do invariably when I get people inviting them into that space of telling stories, I will tell a story first. I will make myself vulnerable, and that seems to give permission for people to step into it a little bit more fully, because they've just seen me, not armoring up. But I think it's a great question, and of course. We get too anxious, we get helpless.
We have Sonia has also raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute her, and then we have probably time for this question, one more afterwards, given our time slot.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sonia, and I have a quick question. Well, are there any practices on how to be concise, or how to tell a story that you want to tell, but speak to the main point without going long-winded? Because you obviously know, like now I'm going to ask this question very long-winded, because when you're trying to make a point, there are just so many things you want to say that you feel like are important, but then the importance goes away because people just lose the track of what you're trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I've just talked for 30 minutes, so I'm not the best person to ask about that. But yes, I think so. And there are practices, and there are, and in the book, I do have 3 chapters, I think it's 3 or 4 chapters about just putting the story together. And when I get people to do things, I always give them a short time. 3 minutes is fine. And I think getting people used to doing that and getting them used to understanding that the main point, they can get the main point across. Because in 3 minutes, you haven't got time for a lot of preamble or a lot of analysis afterwards. So I think it becomes a habit. I think it's just we kind of, when we're uncertain about a story, we tend to do 2 things. One is we tend to over-introduce it. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you here. We're kind of sussing people out as opposed to going straight in. And the other thing is when we're a bit uncertain at the end of it, we can try and then explain what it means. And I discourage both of those practices. I just say, let's hear the story. And when I'm getting people to compose a story, because when we've got time to do that, I will get them to think about what words they will use to end the story. Literally the sentence. I'm not a great believer in writing out stories and remembering them, but those key points, what's my opening line? What's my closing line? What's the line I'm going to use for my key turning point? I get people to think that through, try it out on a partner, write it down, practice it, because it's having those anchors, it's really helpful in being secure in the story, and that helps with concision.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We're now at 11:48. Maybe one last question, and then I'll do some closing remarks about what's coming up. Anybody? Let me see if I can look for my hands raised in this queue here.
I have a quick question. This is Tom here.
Hi, Tom.
I was wondering.
Geoff, I'm wondering if you have any kind of rule of thumb of like how to mix facts and maybe your introduction of a story, or your, for both context and the balance between giving data and sharing a story.
Well, when I teach this, when I work with people, I give them a little exercise, which I do write about in the book quite thoroughly, where I separate story from non-story. And the non-story bit for me is the information and the argument. In other words, the logic. And I help them differentiate those things. And what I say is, I always try and decapitalize story. So it's not a story with a big capital S, it's a story with a small s, or it's an anecdote, or it's a for instance, or it's an example. So I think there are times when it's really helpful to give the information and give the logic for something, the reason for something. And then I invite them to turn toward a story and keep the story clean. So it becomes this is a bit like this, or it's a bit like a story I heard, or it could be like that. So it's a conscious framing of something. It changes from a conversational mode into a story mode, and it needs a kind of a trigger to do that. We need to kind of set that up. And in organizations, you don't kind of say, once upon a time or crick crack or anything like that. You more like to say, well, here's the data, that shows we need to change something. And the reasons are A, B, and C. And I think it would look like this. You're into the story. So I think trying to keep it clean, it also makes it easier to do. And I just say, think of it as an example. Give it as a lively example. And if it hasn't happened, then you have to do the imaginative work. You either find an example of something that is happening that might grow into something bigger, a little green shoot story, or you find what I call an over the rainbow story, which is we're not doing it, but it's happening over there. Let's find a story of that and bring it back. Or if you really have to imagine it. You have to do hard, creative, imaginative work to bring this future or this whatever it is you want to tell about to life. But I think that helps people do that, because as we all know as story practitioners, if you load a story up with lots of information and argument, it just dies on its feet. It can't carry. Stories aren't designed to carry lots of data. They do carry kind of implicit and tacit information, of course they do, but they're not great vehicles for informing or persuading. They're fantastic vehicles for evoking feeling and imagination. And that's why I tell people, if you want to tell a story, why would you tell a story? Because you're trying to make something real for someone. You want them to feel it and imagine it. And then it's up to them what they make of it.
Right.
That's a really good question, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. And then one last, because I can't say no. G. Waller, I'm going to unmute you. So I had to look. How welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm Genevieve, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time today. It's been wonderful. So I have a question. When you have in the past worked with leaders who want to get to that story point, but when you start working with them, you feel that for whatever reason, they're resistant to really going into that heart and soul activity. They have a lot of pressures on them. And again, that whole idea that, yeah, we should tell great stories. How do you encourage them to do that deep digging when you find that it might be a little bit harder than what they've told you, that they're vested in?
Well, you can only go so far. You can't take people further than they want to go. I think being clear about it, and I'm always very clear up front that this is hard work, but it will take at least twice as long as you think it will, and that we probably need a couple of sessions at this. So if they're not up for it, and also you get pretty up to. I think I've worked with lots of people. I've never found someone I couldn't help tell a story if they wanted to tell a story.
Okay.
I have found people who aren't willing to go, here, and so that it's always clunky or it's never really opening. I think it's permission. You can't make someone go there. I think I can, we can encourage it and create a sort of nice, safe environment. Most people can, if you, get talking about, ask them to give an example, not from the workplace, but from something else. Start the conversation about home. Just nudge people gently into that more human space, the life world space. If I can get people to step into the life world space, it's not a problem.
Okay, great.
There is then an issue of people being confident of taking that into the workspace, but that's a kind of coaching issue.
Okay, great.
It's a very good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, at this point, I would like to thank you. And you were very generous at your time of helping us organize and spending time with me on the phone.
You're very welcome. It's a real treat.
Slides. And then for all of us who are on the call that are not members yet, we welcome you to join us on the Stories in Organization.